I'm 67 years old now, and I've learned that the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives are often the most dangerous fictions of all. I was standing in the doorway of our kitchen in North Vancouver on a Tuesday morning in October of 1994, 7 months pregnant, holding a paper bag of groceries from the Save On Foods on Lonsdale because my obstetrician had sent me home early after my appointment, said my blood pressure was slightly elevated and I needed to rest. I'd taken the C-bus back across the inlet, walked the 2 blocks to our building, used my key, opened the door quietly because I thought my husband might be on a work call. He was standing at the kitchen counter with his back to me, both hands pressing into the granite, watching the kettle boil. Standing, upright, without his wheelchair. The grocery bag slipped from my fingers. The sound it made hitting the floor was the sound of my entire life cracking open. He turned around and we looked at each other for what felt like several minutes. The kettle began to scream. Let me go back to the beginning, because some stories can only be understood from the beginning, even when the beginning is painful to sit with. I am 67 years old, and I have grandchildren now, and a garden that gets too much shade in the summer, and I can tell you this story clearly. I couldn't always. It was 1992, and I was 34 years old. I worked as a senior graphic designer at a mid-sized firm in Kitsilano, the kind of job that felt meaningful when I was 26, and had started to feel like a ceiling by the time I was 34. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment on West 4th Avenue that I loved with a fierceness that surprised people. They expected a woman my age to be embarrassed by the smallness of her life. I wasn't, or I told myself I wasn't. My mother called every Sunday from her house in Kelowna. She was a practical woman, not unkind, but she had a way of making her silences do the work her words wouldn't. I would tell her about a project I was proud of, a client who had finally approved a logo after 6 rounds of revisions, and she would say, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," and then a pause, and then, "Your cousin Janet had her 2nd baby this week. Have you spoken to her?" I had a good life. I want to be clear about that. I had friends, I had work I was good at. I hiked the grouse grind every September and believed I would do it until my knees gave out. I was not desperate in the way people sometimes assume women my age must have been. But I was lonely in the way that is very specific to people who have built an entire life around being fine on their own. I was fine. I was so perfectly, exhaustingly fine. My younger sister Lynn called me in March of that year, not about setting me up, but about a fundraising gala she was organizing for the Rick Hansen Foundation. She worked in nonprofit fundraising and had been circling this event for months. "I have an extra ticket," she said. "The guest speaker is supposed to be wonderful. Just come and eat the salmon and drink the wine and stop watching documentaries alone on a Friday night." I went. I wore the green dress I'd bought for a work event the previous fall and drank 2 glasses of white wine and listened to a man named Thomas Sinclair give a 20-minute talk about adaptive outdoor equipment. He was in a wheelchair. He had been, he explained, since a climbing accident on the Squamish Chief 4 years earlier, a rappelling anchor failure. He'd fallen 40 feet, and the impact had left him with a spinal injury at the thoracic level. He said this plainly, without self-pity, in the way of someone who has made peace with a fact through the sheer repetition of stating it. He talked about returning to the mountains in a different way, about the equipment that didn't exist for people like him, about building a company to make it. He had dark eyes and a dry sense of humor, and he paused at exactly the right moments, and he looked out at the audience like he was having a private conversation with each of us individually. Lynn found me afterward by the dessert table. "Well," she said, "you've gone a very specific color." I had also, it turned out, walked directly into his line of sight when I crossed the room, and he had sent someone to ask if I wanted to join the table he was hosting for the after-dinner drinks. His name was Thomas, though he said to call him Tom. His company was called True North Adaptive, and it made custom outdoor gear for people with physical disabilities, modified kayak paddles, all-terrain wheelchair attachments, adaptive hiking poles. He had a business partner named Greg who handled the operational side while Tom focused on design and product development from his home office. He was 38, had grown up in West Vancouver, and had a mother named Elaine who, he mentioned with obvious fondness, had been his fiercest advocate after the accident. His ex-girlfriend Caroline had left him 8 months after the accident, he said, not unkindly, as if reporting weather. Some people can't picture a future that looks different from what they planned. He said this without bitterness, and I thought, at the time, that it was one of the most gracious things I had ever heard anyone say about someone who had hurt them. I thought about Caroline for months after that evening. What kind of woman walks away from someone she loves because his body has changed? What kind of small, frightened person does that make you? We started seeing each other in April. It required adjustments I hadn't anticipated, not difficult ones, just ones that asked me to pay attention differently. Our apartment buildings were not the same accessible quality. Restaurant reservations had to be checked in advance. I learned to position myself on his left side when we were out together because his left shoulder was more comfortable for navigating narrow spaces. I took a weekend workshop through the BC Paraplegic Association because I wanted to understand weight transfers and positioning properly, not because he asked me to, but because I believed that loving someone well meant learning their world. My mother drove down from Kelowna to meet him in June and was unexpectedly charmed. His mother, Elaine, invited us for Sunday dinners at her house in West Vancouver, a beautiful rancher she'd had retrofitted with wider doorways and a roll-in shower years ago, after the accident. She cried the first time I came for dinner. I thought I understood why. I held her hand across the table and told her I wasn't going anywhere. I meant it. I want you to know that I meant it absolutely. Tom proposed on the ferry between Horseshoe Bay and Langdale during a September crossing, when the sun was low and the water was silver, and Georgia Strait looked like something from the inside of a dream. He'd arranged with the crew to be on the forward deck at the right time. He held a small box in his lap and looked up at me and said, "You make me feel like myself. Marry me." I said yes. And I cried, and a deckhand we didn't know started clapping, and Tom laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from his whole chest. We married the following June in a small ceremony at a garden venue in Deep Cove. 35 people. My sister Lynn read a poem. The venue had a beautifully paved path through the garden, and I had personally walked it 3 times before booking it to confirm there were no gravel sections that would be difficult. I thought, at the time, that this was what love looked like in action, paying attention to the details that mattered to someone else. We bought a unit in a newer strata building in North Vancouver. Ground floor, accessible bathroom, wide hallways, a kitchen designed with lower counters on one side. I hired a contractor to add a roll-out pantry shelf and modify the shower controls. I spent $4,000 of my own RRSP savings on those renovations and felt good about every dollar. I cut my hours at the design firm. Not immediately, it happened gradually, the way things do when you rationalize each small step. First, I started working 4 days a week so I could handle more of our shared logistics. Then I took on fewer large accounts and more freelance work I could do from home. By the time I was 6 months pregnant, I had essentially stopped going into the office. It wasn't a sacrifice I resented. I want to be honest about that. I believed I was building a life that worked for both of us, and building felt purposeful. I should tell you, I also loved him. I loved him in a way that felt earned, specific. Not the fuzzy romantic love of my 20s, but something more like recognition. I loved the way he thought about problems, the precision of his mind, the fact that he always had an opinion but always genuinely wanted to hear yours first. I loved that he had made something beautiful out of loss. I loved being useful to someone who deserved to be loved well. Elaine suggested, gently, over one of our Sunday dinners in late summer, that now might be a natural time for me to step back from client work entirely. "With the baby coming," she said, "you'll want to be fully present." Tom nodded. I remember thinking that the word present felt slightly odd, like it was doing double duty for something else. But I was 8 months pregnant and tired, and I filed the feeling away. Which brings me back to October, to the paper bag on the floor, to the kettle screaming. Tom turned off the kettle. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He was standing in our kitchen, in socks, both feet flat on the floor, the wheelchair folded against the wall like something forgotten. I think I said his name. I'm not entirely sure. What I remember clearly is the specific quality of silence in that room, the way it had texture to it, like something you could put your hands on. "I can explain," he said. "There is a particular kind of confusion that isn't confusion at all. It's your mind refusing to accept what it already understands." I stood in the doorway of our kitchen for what felt like a very long time, my hand on the doorframe, and I watched my husband stand in front of me, and I knew, with absolute clarity, what was happening, and also could not make it feel real. "You're not in a wheelchair," I said. "No, you weren't injured." He took a breath. "I had a climbing accident. That part is true. I broke 2 ribs and my wrist. Nothing to my spine. I recovered completely. That was the accident you told me about." "Yes, and everything after that was not," he said. I sat down on the floor. Not dramatically, I just found I couldn't stand anymore. I sat down with my back against the wall and my hands on my belly, and I looked at my husband standing upright in our kitchen, and I said, "Why?" He told me. It took a long time and I interrupted him several times, and once I asked him to stop because I thought I was going to be sick, but eventually I understood the shape of it. After the real accident, after his full recovery, Caroline had left anyway. Not because of his disability, there had been no disability by then, but for the reasons people always leave. She said he was emotionally unavailable. She said he prioritized work over the relationship. She said she felt invisible. He was devastated in the way of someone who has been told an uncomfortable truth about himself and has chosen to call it abandonment instead. His mother, Elaine, was the one who had suggested it. She had watched him pull away from everyone after Caroline, watched him throw himself into True North Adaptive and convince himself that he didn't need connection. She said he needed to find someone who would choose him for his character, not his company's success, not his physical fitness, not the life they could build together if everything went right. Someone who would stay when things were hard. So they built the story. The accident. The spinal injury. The wheelchair. His business partner Greg knew he'd made accommodations for years, told anyone who asked that Tom simply didn't discuss the accident in professional settings. Elaine had coordinated it so carefully that I had never had reason to question it. "My mother," I said slowly. "Does my mother know?" He hesitated. That half-second pause was its own answer. "No," he said. "Not about the accident, but she knew what we were looking for. In a partner. My mother may have suggested to Lynn that the gala would be a place to meet someone, open-minded. My sister. He didn't say it directly, but I heard it. Lynn, who had the extra ticket. Lynn, who had positioned us in the same sightline. I stood up. "This is the part of the story where I wish I could tell you I said something precise and devastating, something that perfectly captured what I was feeling. What I actually did was walk to the front door, open it, walk to the elevator, take it to the lobby, and sit on the bench outside the building in the October rain for a long time. The baby kicked twice. I put my hand on my side and said out loud to no one, 'I don't know what to do.' My sister came when I called her. She drove across the Second Narrows Bridge in traffic and found me still sitting on the lobby bench, damp and bewildered. She held my hands and I told her what had happened. Her face changed in a way I'd never seen before. She started to cry before I finished speaking. 'Lynn,' I said, 'did you know?' Not the full story. I swear. Elaine told me Tom had been through something hard, that he'd had a difficult time trusting people after his last relationship. She said she thought you two might understand each other." She wiped her face. "I didn't know it was a deception. I thought she was just doing a mother thing." I believed her. I still believe her. But I hung on to that piece of information that I had been arranged like furniture for a long time. I called my mother from Lynn's car, parked outside the building. It was after 9 by then. My mother answered on the second ring, and I told her everything in about 4 sentences, and then I waited. "Elaine mentioned," my mother said carefully, "that Tom had gone through a period where he'd had trouble letting people in." "She told you more than that," I said. Silence. "She may have told me that Tom had found a way to sort of simplify things. In the early stages of meeting someone." I hung up. I didn't go home that night. I slept in Lynn's guest room with one of her old pregnancy pillows and stared at the ceiling and felt the baby move in slow, calm waves, completely indifferent to the collapse happening above her. Tom called 12 times. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that I listened to exactly once. "Please come home. I know I don't deserve you to come home. Please come home anyway." I deleted it. Elaine came to Lynn's building the next afternoon. She rang the buzzer and Lynn answered, and I heard the entire conversation through the intercom. "Please tell her I'd just like to speak with her." Lynn said I wasn't available. Elaine said she would wait in the lobby. Lynn told her, very calmly and with the particular firmness my sister produces when she is trying very hard to remain Canadian about something, that waiting in the lobby would not change the situation and she should go home. The things I was most angry about were not the things I'd expected. I had expected to be angry about the lie itself, and I was a fury so clean and cold it surprised me. But what I hadn't expected was the anger I felt about the accommodation ramp on our building entrance, about the $4,000 of renovations, about every restaurant I had pre-screened, every meeting I had rescheduled, every conversation at a party where I had quietly positioned myself to manage logistics so that Tom's experience would be easier. I had given those things freely and gladly, and I had done it because I believed he needed them. He had watched me give them. He had let me. Had he laughed? Had he, in some private part of himself, found it amusing? I was 7 months pregnant, and I had no full-time income, and most of my savings were in renovations I'd made to a condo that was his name on the mortgage. I was 36 years old, and I had built a life around a fiction. Lynn found me a therapist through her employee assistance connections. Dr. Priya Sharma had an office in a low-brick building near Lonsdale Quay, and she had a quality of stillness that I found either very calming or slightly unnerving, depending on my mood. In our first session, she let me talk for 40 minutes without interrupting. When I stopped, she said, "What is the loss that feels the biggest right now?" "Not the betrayal," I said. "The version of myself I'd become." She nodded slowly. "Tell me about the version of yourself before you met him," I told her. The apartment on West 4th, the grouse grind, the freelance work I'd liked more than the firm work, the long Saturday mornings where I answered to no one. "And what drew you to Tom specifically?" she asked. "Not what you loved about him. What drew you to the situation?" I said. "He needed me in a specific way." "Say more." I sat with that for a long time. The truth was harder than I wanted it to be. The truth was that I had felt, for years, like I was too much of something, too independent, too particular, too settled into my own ways for most men I met. And Tom had offered me a version of partnership where being capable and patient and organized was not just tolerated but required, where the parts of me that had felt like obstacles to intimacy suddenly became the point. I had loved being needed in a way that matched exactly what I had to give. "That doesn't mean you're wrong, Doctor," Sharma said. "It means you're human. And it means that two people can each be working from a place of fear and still genuinely love each other. Those things coexist." "He still lied to me," I said. "He absolutely did. And that requires accountability and repair. I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm asking whether you want to understand it before you decide anything." Tom came to the second session. It was the first time I'd seen him in 3 weeks, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping, which gave me a feeling I recognized with some shame as satisfaction. He had pushed his wheelchair into the waiting room, and I'd looked at it, and then at him, and said, "You don't have to bring that." He left it by the door. Dr. Sharma asked him the same question she'd asked me. "What drew you to this particular deception?" He answered honestly. I'll give him that he had, by this point, stopped managing the story and started telling the truth, which was messier and less sympathetic. He said he was not good with people and had always known it. He said the wheelchair had given him a reason for his silences, for his discomfort in social situations, for the way he sometimes went days without wanting to talk to anyone. It gave other people a framework for his strangeness. It made him legible, and it weeded out, efficiently, anyone who would find him too much trouble. "And me," I said. "I wasn't too much trouble." "You were the opposite," he said. "You showed up with information you'd researched. You'd taken a workshop. I hadn't even suggested it. You did the work before I even knew I needed it. Because I thought you needed it. I know. You let me think that. I know." His voice was very quiet. "I'm ashamed of that more than anything else." "Doctor," Sharma said, "shame isn't the same as change. What are you willing to actually do?" He listed things. Couples counseling, weekly. Individual therapy. Full financial transparency. He offered to put the condo in both names immediately, to set up an account for me that was entirely my own, to fund my return to freelance design work however I needed. He said he would answer any question I asked, forever, no matter what it cost him to answer it. "I need to think," I said. "I need you to not push me while I'm thinking." "Okay," he said. and I need you to understand that I might decide this isn't fixable." He looked at me and his eyes were full of something I didn't want to identify yet. "I understand," he said. "I moved back home when I was 8 months pregnant, not because I'd decided anything, but because Lynn's guest room had a futon and my back was in open revolt. Tom had moved into the second bedroom. He had left a note on the kitchen counter. 'I made the bed in your room. Fresh towels in the bathroom. There's soup in the fridge. The butternut squash one you like. No pressure about anything.' I ate the soup. I didn't thank him, but I ate it." Our daughter arrived 3 weeks later on a Thursday morning, which was unremarkable until she wasn't unremarkable anymore, which is what happens the moment you see them. They put her on my chest and she was furious about being born, screaming with absolute conviction, and I laughed because she seemed so certain that someone had made a very poor decision. I looked up and Tom was in the corner of the delivery room with both hands over his mouth. "Do you want to hold her?" I asked. He came to the bedside and I put her in his arms and watched his face go completely quiet. Not the managed quiet I'd known for 2 years, the performed stillness of someone pretending not to react to sound or sensation. Something else. The quiet of a person who has walked into a moment too large for words. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like a potato," I said. "All newborns do." He laughed, an actual laugh. And something in me shifted, slightly, like a window being opened in a room that's been closed too long. We named her Rose, after my mother, which surprised everyone including me. My mother drove down from Kelowna when Rose was 4 days old and sat in the rocking chair in the nursery for an hour without saying a single unnecessary thing. When she left, she held my hand at the door and said, "I should have told you what Elaine told me. I thought I was helping and I was wrong and I'm sorry." I didn't tell her it was fine. I said, "Thank you for saying that." It was the most I could give her then. Elaine I didn't see for 7 months. She sent cards. She sent gifts for Rose that were thoughtful and not excessive. She did not come by uninvited. When I finally agreed to meet her for coffee at a place on Lonsdale, she sat across from me and didn't try to explain herself before she apologized. "What I did," she said, "came from fear." I watched my son shut himself away and I thought I knew the solution, and I applied it without asking whether I had any right to. I didn't have that right. "You deserve to be trusted with the truth from the beginning." "Why didn't you tell me yourself?" I said, "when you could see I was giving things up. You watched me give things up." She was quiet for a moment. "I told myself that what you were giving wasn't wasted, that it was still going towards something real, that the love between you was real even if the circumstances weren't." She folded her hands on the table. "I know that's not good enough." "It isn't," I said. "No." We sat in silence for a while. Outside the window, the North Shore Mountains had their first snow on the peaks. "If you want a relationship with your granddaughter," I said, "I need you to understand that I'm not the person you recruited. I'm not patient by nature. I'm not accommodating by nature. I chose to be those things for someone I believed needed them, and that was my choice, but it is not my identity, and I will not be managed." Elaine looked at me steadily. "I understand that now," she said. "I think I understand that better than you might expect." She found her own therapist. I know because she told me, and because Tom mentioned it. She worked, as far as I could tell, at understanding why she had believed a good outcome could be built on deception. It didn't make us close, but it made Sunday dinners, eventually, something other than an endurance exercise. Tom and I kept going to Dr. Sharma. We went every 2 weeks for the first year, monthly after that. He answered every question I asked. Some of the answers were hard. Yes, there were moments he had found it funny, not in a cruel way, he was careful to say, but in the way of someone watching an elaborate mistake they had started and couldn't find a way to stop. Some of the answers were harder. No, he had not told his business partner Greg to stop covering for him even after the wedding, and Greg still knew, and that had been a betrayal compounded. I called Greg and had one conversation with him that I ended by saying I was choosing to believe he had been in an impossible position and that I was not going to relitigate it, but that if he ever withheld anything material from me again about my own husband, I would make sure every adaptive sports organization in British Columbia knew exactly why I had stopped supporting True North Adaptive. Greg said, "That is completely fair." I believed him and also meant it. The wheelchair went into storage. Tom suggested donating it. I said not yet. I'm not entirely sure what I was holding on to by keeping it there, whether it was evidence or grief or simply a reminder that I was allowed to not be finished being angry. I donated it 2 years later to a young man connected to the BC Paraplegic Association who actually needed it. It felt, by then, like the right time. We had a second child 3 years after Rose, a boy we named Daniel. By then, we had moved to a larger place in Lynn Valley, a house this time, with a proper garden and enough bedrooms that the children could eventually be in separate rooms and everyone could sleep. The accessible features were still there. The wide hallways, the modified shower, and we kept them because it turned out that a wider hallway is simply a better hallway and there was no reason to undo what we'd built. I went back to design work when Rose was 18 months old. Tom hired a part-time nanny 2 days a week without being asked and took full parental leave when Daniel was born. He did not make it into a negotiation. I noticed this. It mattered. On our 10th anniversary, we sat in the backyard on a Saturday evening in June with a bottle of wine from the Okanagan and Rose asleep upstairs and Daniel turning circles in the grass, and Tom said, "I know I can't ask you whether it was worth it. That's not a fair question to put on you." He paused. "But I want you to know that I know the difference between the person you were trying to be for me and the person you actually are, and I love the actual one better." I drank my wine. I looked at him across the table in the evening light. "You don't get credit for that," I said. "You should have loved her from the beginning." "Yes," he said, "I should have. But you do know the difference now." "I do." "That's something," I said. "That was 23 years ago. We are 67 and 68 now, and Rose has 2 children of her own, a boy and a girl, and they call us Grandma and Grandpa and argue over who sits next to me at dinner, which I find so disproportionately moving that I occasionally have to go into the kitchen for a moment. Daniel is engaged, a lovely woman he met in graduate school in Montreal, and they are planning a wedding for next summer that involves a tent and a lake and what sounds like a very ambitious amount of logistics, and I have said nothing, not one word, because it is not my wedding. Tom and I walk in the evenings when the weather allows. Not the grouse grind, we're past that now, though I did it one final time at 62 just to know that I still could. Shorter trails, the ones in Lynn Headwaters with the wide packed paths and the good light through the Douglas firs. He walks beside me, and sometimes he takes my hand, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we don't. I will not tell you that everything was worth it. I don't believe in that accounting, the idea that suffering is retroactively justified by the good things that follow. What happened to me in those years was a real harm done by people who told themselves they were doing something kind, which is the most corrosive kind of harm because it asks the person who was hurt to be generous about the intentions of the people who hurt them. I was not always generous. I am still not always generous. There are mornings when I wake up and look at the man next to me and feel, briefly, the sharp edge of what was taken from me, the years of choices made inside a fiction, the version of myself I might have been if I had been given the truth and the chance to choose freely. But then I think about Dr. Sharma asking me what the version of myself before Tom looked like, and I think about my honest answer, and I know that the woman I've become, the one who says what she means and asks for what she needs and does not make herself smaller to make anyone else more comfortable, was built, in part, from the necessity of refusing to disappear inside someone else's story. I chose to stay, not because I had to, not because of Rose or Daniel or the mortgage or any practical arithmetic. I chose to stay because when I looked at the real person, not the managed fiction, not the patient, gracious man in the wheelchair who had given me a useful purpose, but the awkward, frightened, complicated, genuinely loving man underneath, I decided he was worth the work. He chose the same thing. Every day since. I won't tell you it was easy. I won't tell you there was a moment when it became simple. What I'll tell you is that we talk now in a way I could not have imagined in those early years, an honesty that has some cost to it every time, and we pay it willingly, and that feels like something worth having. It feels like the truest thing I know.